Hello everyone, I am Bob Lingle of Off the Beaten Path Bookstore in Lakewood, New York, and this is the Weaponized Literacy Podcast. Over the past year, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with investigative reporters, social activists, astrophysicists, philosophers, military veterans, and just plain old writers. We discuss life, death, and all of the things that happen in between. Our goal is to use the power of the written word to create a better understanding of the world around us and the people that live in it. We do this by reading with purpose, and we invite you to join in our effort to weaponize literacy. Hello everyone, welcome to our event tonight. Our guest is librarian Brett Ann Stanciu, who is a graduate of Marlborough College and recipient of a Vermont Arts Council Creation Grant. Her 2015 novel, Hidden View, portrays the challenges of a hardscrabble family farm. Her 2021 work, Unstitched, details the real-life challenges of a small community. She lives in Northeast Kingdom of Vermont with her family. Ladies and gentlemen, Brett Ann Stanciu. Thanks for joining us tonight, Brett.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here tonight.
And I also I want to thank Anthony at Steerforth Press. Anthony has been a great partner for quite a few of our events, and also everyone watching tonight. If anyone watching has any questions throughout the event, you can use the comment feature on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, and those will pull over to us, and we'll be able to hopefully answer them. But getting into your book, Unstitched, it explores the opioid epidemic in your community. What was the catalyst that brought you into wanting to explore the situation?
So I guess the first thing I would say about Unstitched is it's not the book I originally set out to write. It's not a book I ever intended to write. So my first book, for those of you who read it, was a novel, and the name of the book is Hidden View, and it's about farming and marriage in Vermont. But what happened and the way Unstitched came about, it's a very different book. It's a nonfiction book. I would consider it nonfiction narrative / memoir. I was working in a rural one-room library. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Vermont, there's a number of little tiny libraries. And this was a one-room library attached to a school. And I was the only staff member there. And I was recently divorced at the time, and my life had gone through a number of changes. And slowly I began to realize as I first started working there that someone was breaking in after hours. And it took me a little while to figure out who this person was. It was kind of a mystery to me at first because the library, when I first entered it in the mornings, often smelled of cigarette smoke. So it took me a while to sort of begin to put the pieces together. And when I did, again, this is small town Vermont. There are less than 1,000 people who lived in the town. I began to realize through the rumor mill that the man lived nearby. And while I talk about him to some extent in the first chapter, what's really important to know is that it was rumored he was using opioids, and that also I really wanted nothing to do with him. I didn't want to get tangled up in his story. Eventually what happened is I pursued keeping him out of the library involving law enforcement. And this was rural Vermont. It is rural Vermont. Law enforcement is somewhat hard to find at times. And I ran into struggles through that. So he continued to break into the library. And then one afternoon when the library was closed, a trustee walked in after hours, found him. And shortly after that, he went back to his parents' house and he committed suicide. And I was really shocked by this. I was, in fact, just stunned. And I immediately began to see that his story was connected to my story in ways that I never realized. And that began me asking questions. So the book, essentially Unstitched, comes out of that incident, although there's quite a bit more behind it. So that's a brief way of starting that.
No, that's perfect. Before I get into my next question, I had commented before we went live that it sounded like a storm is rolling in, and it's here. It seems pretty intense. If I lose power, I'm going to try to reconnect through my phone. I just want to have that as a backup plan. So hang tight, everyone. Hopefully that doesn't happen. There was one other event that we did where it was a huge storm throughout the event, and we ended up losing power right when the event ended. So if we lose power, hopefully we have the same luck and timing.
We'll just hope for the best on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To get into my background, why I was really excited when Anthony reached out about doing an event with you. My dad had struggled with addiction for a good chunk of his life. He was a Vietnam veteran, got mixed up into it there, battled with it for most of his life and like my early childhood. He was clean for a really long time. During that process, my family, my brother and sister and I would go to a couple of his NA meetings. And during that experience, one of those experiences, my dad was celebrating like 2 years or 5 years clean. There was a guy that had recently celebrated 17 years clean or 15 years clean. And he was there celebrating one day. So that kind of like really hit home as we were going through this process, because we had watched my dad relapse a number of times, that the challenge and the hold that addiction has on people. And lo and behold, my dad ended up being clean for 17 years and ended up relapsing. And it was a rough situation, as you can imagine. What I found interesting, just growing up in that environment and having that realization, I just kind of had an assumption that like everyone saw addiction as this continuing disease. Not many people have the misfortune of learning that lesson when they're 10. So when I was reading the book, and I'm glad that you were the person that wrote this story, and I was able to watch your evolution of addiction isn't a disease. Can you kind of walk us through where you were in the beginning of the book, in your view of addiction?
Yeah, I will. Thank you for telling me that story. I will say, first of all, my heart goes out to you in many, many ways that I don't particularly need to share right now, but I'm giving that to you. So thank you for sharing that. I think what's important for me to say that at the very beginning, when I first started writing this book, including when I was at the library that very first afternoon, I really held a stigma against this man, and I really considered him other than me. But the more I began to look at addiction and the more I began to question it, I realized there was a much deeper story to that. And part of that is me understanding the causes of addiction. The disease is much more complicated. And part of that is really me understanding myself as well, too. So the stigma that I held against this man, I was able to hide behind that librarian persona and say, I'm a librarian, this is who I am publicly. But behind that, I had really struggled with addiction, and I had never spoken publicly about it at all. So it was very easy for me to hide behind that. So one of the most profound things I learned about addiction is it operates on so many levels. There are so many ripples that interconnect in between that. And some of that is the world that we live in. And a lot of that is how we as individuals look at the world and look at ourselves. So when I initially turned in the manuscript, I wrote about my story to understand addiction. And I wrote in here, I reach out to medical workers and the local police chief, all the sort of societal pieces that I put together. And then my editor at Steerforth asked me to rewrite the book and put much more of my story into it. And at first I thought, no, I cannot do that. I just will not do that. I can't look at that part of my life. I've put it away. But then I realized if I was really going to write about addiction and write about it with real fidelity, I had to put myself in the story. And it wasn't a self-centered thing to do it. It was an honest thing to do it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it's kind of your initial thought on it, and was more along the lines, not that I'm correcting what you're saying, but
no. I think I got it.
But was more along the lines of where you kind of learned about addiction and genes and genetics and how that can play into it. It was more of well, this is a personal failing of the person, of the individual, rather than it being like whether or not how they got involved in whatever they're addicted to. It was that personal failing that they couldn't overcome the addiction.
Right. Actually, so this is a really important question. And this is a question that I examined from the get-go. So there's often this tension around addiction. Is it a disease or is it simply bad behavior?
Mm-hmm.
And this makes all the difference in the world, because if it's a disease, then we don't hold people responsible. If it's bad behavior, it's entirely their own fault. So I was really pushed to think much harder about disease and addiction by the medical workers that I talked to. And what they really made me look at is I had a real misunderstanding of disease. So there's one kind of disease that's like a common cold that we get. But then there's much more complex diseases, because we're complex people as human beings. Heart disease is complex. Part of this is genetics. Part of this is lifestyle. Part of this is background. So addiction, when I really began to look at it, there's a physical part. So there's definitely a genetic part, without a doubt. And anyone who has addiction who runs in a family knows that. But there's also much deeper layers in terms of where we're born as a child, the kind of family we grow up in, the kind of life that we drift into. And there are no easy answers to any of that. And it really took me to I was really illuminated by this understanding when I spoke to particularly 3 people who had recovered, or at least are recovered now, from addiction, for me to see that there's a whole bunch of layers there. And for us to point fingers at people is really superficial.
And I like that you put that distinction in. There's a few people that we've worked with at the store that they wrote out their memoir and like, oh, this is my recovery story. Like, this is how I beat my addiction. Yeah. And just with my experience, I'm like, don't say that. I'm like, you beat it for now. don't take that for granted.
This is never like a race or a done deal. It doesn't work that way. And that was also one of the biggest lessons I had to learn, that that's not something you can ever just put away and you're done with. That's there forever. I mean, yeah.
There was a quote that I lifted from towards the end of the book from Sam, that recovery is a journey for a lifetime. And I think that's one of the important takeaways from your book.
Yeah.
Of many.
Yeah.
Your book is broken down into 3 sections called I just combined all 3 words into one: body, mind, and heart.
Yeah.
What was the thought process behind those distinctions?
So those organically came out of me understanding too. So there's a real body component to addiction, and that's drugs are physically addictive. There's no question about it. And many of our bodies are genetically driven to have addictive behavior. That's one part of it. Mind is another part of that, because who we are, who we think about ourselves in the world, and that more intellectual process is another big piece of it. But so is heart and the kind of people we are. That's also a piece of it. So those reflect society as a whole, but they also reflect us as individuals as a whole too. And addiction affects all of those.
For your own, and are you comfortable talking about your own recovery? Okay.
The book
you were forced to into the book, so
I've crossed that threshold now.
Yeah. So how did your work in the exploration of the people that you talked to, how did that help or kind of mold your own recovery? So what did you learn from that?
So I interviewed a number of people. In Unstitched, there's 3 interviews with people in recovery who appear, and then one couple who really tragically lost their daughter to an overdose. These are all very different stories. And I will say that all of these people taught me so much about courage and really laid it out for me. And they spoke with me not for any of their own personal gain by any means, but they all spoke with me because they had endured terrible things. And at that time, they had made it through. They had somehow crossed through to the other side. And they spoke out of this incredible impetus to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So Shauna Shepherd, who's one of those people I spoke to, told me early on that the one thing she would say to people who were struggling is that recovery is possible. And it's that word possible that braids all through my book, that there is this possibility. There's never a guarantee, but there's a possibility. And so by these people speaking so bravely to me, it made me realize that modeled for me really good behavior. And it modeled for me, if I was going to write with real honesty, I had to write with real honesty about myself too.
You did a very good job of during, like, as you were writing out the conversations that you had with people, I could feel your hesitancy to want to talk about your own addiction and where things were coming from. So yeah. No question there, just a kudos of strong writing there.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I wanted to I'm just kind of looking through my notes here, switch to a quick lighter note.
Yeah.
You had referenced that you were reading Where the Crawdads Sing at one point while you were doing this. What did you think of Where the Crawdads Sing?
I loved that book. I really did. Yeah, that book that again was a book that had such incredibly good writing. I was in that place at that time. And that's one of those books. Well, as a bookseller, I was a bookseller too, for those of you that don't know. As a bookseller, one of the great things you get to do is say, hey, you need to read this book. You need to read this book. I love this book. You might love it too. And that's one of those books. Yeah.
I go through the struggle when a book is that popular.
Yeah.
I'm a one-person operation, so I know that people are going to like the book. So I haven't read the book yet. Maybe at some point after I retire, I will read the book. But we get advanced copies of books all the time. And it's like every other month we get 50 books and they come in. My wife and I will divvy them up and we'll try to read as many as we can. But once a book is on the shelf, if I haven't read it, it's very rare that I will have a chance to read it. And I was curious to get your take, because with that book, for our customers, it was either this is the best book I've ever read, or for people that are extremely avid readers, like booksellers and librarians, it was either this is really good or just okay. So I'm glad to see that as a librarian and former bookseller, you still had it in high regard.
I do. It is funny. There are just certain books that way, like, not to change the subject, but along those lines, Helder Laxness's Independent People. I don't know if you've ever read this book. It's either the book of people's lives who they love or they hate this book. And everyone I know who's read it, it's divided along those two lines. But that book is also worth a look at.
That's kind of all. Frederick Bachman is really big for us at the store, and almost all of his books, people either love them or hate them. So
I have to confess, he's a writer I haven't read. And you know how there are writers where you just feel like I should have read this book, and then you just haven't at a certain point.
Well, then we're even. You haven't read Frederick Bachman, and I haven't read one of the most popular books in the last decade.
So we'll call it a draw then.
We've had more people join in since we started, so I just wanted to reiterate, if anyone has questions, you can use the comment feature on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, and we'll answer those as best as we can. I also wanted to establish, 2 weeks ago, we had a discussion about suicide, and we had an expert on suicide from the Suicide Prevention Alliance of Chautauqua County. As a bookstore owner and a librarian, we each have our own experience. You have done a lot of work. We're not experts on the topic. So for anyone locally, I had reached out just through social media, said, what are the best resources around here? And there's Prevention Works, and there's also the Mental Health Association of Chautauqua County. So if you had specific questions or needed help in any sort of way, I would direct you there. If you have questions about layman's work and our own personal explorations into opioids and addiction, we are also here for those questions.
Yeah. If I could just go on for one more second from that.
Absolutely.
So Unstitched is about opioid addiction, but it's also about addiction as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about my own struggles with addiction in this book, and I have a lot of regrets in my life. But one of the main things I do want to encourage people, if you are struggling or you know someone who's struggling, reach out and ask for help. That's something I wish I had done many, many years ago. It might have made a whole difference. So sometimes just being brave, stretching out there and reaching and asking for help, it might be worth the effort. So I just want to put that out there.
And you, if you wanted to talk more about at what point did you realize that you had a problem with alcohol, and what was your process to get through that?
So I do talk about this in the book, and there's quite a bit more I haven't put in. I was aware of this for many years, ever since I was a teenager, to be honest. I really did know that. And then, your life goes on, things change, it evolves. And again, there's nothing at all simple about addiction by any means. It's not like you wake up and you get a test and there's a clear-cut diagnosis. But I had tried for years to quit drinking. And I never did reach out for help. I never did speak publicly about it. And then, honestly, there was a certain point where I just hit a line. And there was I talk about a moment in the book, but really, I had just hit a point where something changed in my life. And I hate to say this, but I read a book at the time, and this sounds like a cliche because I never, ever read self-help books. But I read this book by Charles Duhigg, and I belonged to a small library at the time. There wasn't a lot of books there, and so I often read books that were just there and were new, and I picked them up. And this book was called The Power of Habit. And when I read it, all of a sudden I began to realize that addiction was really a habit, and I had never really thought about that. And I began to realize from reading this book, if I began to change the habit, I could begin to change my life. And I did. And I did it not in one day, but I made a decision one day, and I never really ever went back. And I just went day by day by day. And it sounds like the hardest thing in the world, and it was by far the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But as Sam says in the book, who I interviewed, he said the same 1,000 reasons were there 10 years ago as they were the day that he quit. It was just my life had shifted, and I decided I was going to take my life back.
And there's just you talking just kind of brought to mind a lot of things with my dad's addiction, because his recovery process, it was just kind of it's long. And he ended up relapsing after a long time, but it was like 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and then he'd relapse. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and then he'd relapse. So it is just such a huge, huge struggle. And just the number of conversations that I've had with other people in recovery while my dad was going through that process, especially after he relapsed after being clean for such a long time. It was, Shauna, the one person in your work, made me think of it, was that you start using in your head a long time before you start actually physically using again. And Shauna's experience, and then your experience sitting outside of the place where you used to pick up your drinks made me think of that. We had talked about one of the driving forces of the book was kind of the man that was using opioids, was breaking into the library. Was there? It seemed like a bit of guilt was a part of that. Of could you have helped him after going through this experience and everything that you learned? Do you still have that guilt? think that you could have helped him or done something differently in that time?
That's a really interesting question that nobody ever asked me or hasn't asked me yet. And I think in many ways, writing this whole book in many ways was an atonement for things I've done in my life. Yeah. And I also realize that there's some things that you just can't ever be forgiven for. And that's just really the way it is. Yeah. If I had been a different woman at that time, I would have made totally different choices. That doesn't mean that he wouldn't have died. It doesn't mean I'm not responsible for his life. It just means maybe something different would have happened at that time. And I'll never know that. Yeah.
I think the book is relevant for so many things, but that experience in that relationship or lack of relationship with that man, we had been talking about before we went live, the last year and a half, and the division that we've seen, and where do we draw the line between trying to create connections or create bridges and trying to provide some sort of protection for ourselves. And this is a good example of it's not a clear line where could you have helped him? Like, would he have been ready to receive any sort of help?
And who knows? I mean, who knows? When you look back at, like when I look back at my life now, I can see there are certain junctures where my life could have gone one way or could have gone the other way. And there's a little while ago, I saw this really interesting documentary that maybe you've seen. I forget the name of it now, but it was about 3 triplets who were separated at birth. It's a very famous case study. And what's really interesting in there is how similar the twins were, but also how different they were. And at the end of that documentary, there's a line where it sort of reflects the drift that we have in our life. So we often end up in lives where we're just kind of drifting along. We're born into these circumstances, right? So I was born a white woman in this particular space. My parents, I grew up in New Mexico and then in New Hampshire, drifted into these things. Like I really just drifted into drinking. But then at a certain point, do we stop that drift? Do we then become self-aware? And that's what Sam in my book says. You got to stop that drift at a certain point. Otherwise, maybe your life will drift off and you'll just be fine, but maybe not. And that might really matter to the people around you too. It's an interesting way of looking at the world that only recently I began to see, like the profound impact of looking at the world that way.
We've had the good fortune of, there's been a number of recurring themes in the conversations that we've had through these virtual author events. And one that has come up a few times is the chance of birth and where you grow up. This is with the experience that I had growing up. There was a situation where it was kind of fighting against my own circumstances, and it was a high school biology class, and I just had the misfortune of being in the class with all of the troublemakers. I was not a good science student to begin with, and I'm just like, I'm just trying to learn here. And I had a good relationship with the teacher, and I was talking with her, and she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry that you're in this class," and she didn't get into the specifics, but like, "Oh, like a few of these kids really have a tough home life," and I'm like, "Can I tell you about my life?" She's like, "Oh, I had no idea." So that just kind of the balance of not everyone has the ability to overcome their circumstances, but fortunately, I was able to. It seems like I'm bragging, but maybe I am.
Well, maybe, but also maybe you're also just being. Sometimes when we seem like we're bragging, we're also just being honest, right? So my guess is, for whatever reasons, you ended up becoming really self-reflective about your life. And sometimes something that seems like the worst curse imaginable and maybe is, can also be one of your greatest strengths too.
Mm.
You,
I think I've used this quote in one of our other events, and I always preface it with the fact that I never thought I'd be a person to quote Tony Robbins, the self-help guy. But I had watched Tony Robbins is Not Your Guru, the documentary,
yeah,
and there's a line in it where a girl had a similar situation to what I had grown up in.
yeah,
And Tony Robbins said, well, if you want to blame your dad for all the things that he did wrong, you also have to blame him for all the things that he did right.
yeah,
And being self-reflective and aware, and just kind of like, I know that I have an addictive personality,
yeah,
which is why I've never used, like, I
yeah.
have the occasional drink, but like, I'm now addicted to my bookstore, which is why I'm here late into the evening talking to authors and writing a podcast like this. The bookstore is my addiction, and I'm okay with that. There are worse things.
Well, and it's your passion. I mean, like anything else, your passion can also be a very positive thing too, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's more, is it being creative or is it being destructive, right?
Mhm.
And my guess is you've chosen more creative passions and more creative habits. So nice job. Good work. And that's along with that whole like Joseph Campbell thing too, about like stepping out of, that cycle, right? How do you break those chains of the past? You could look at your life in that way. Like you, for whatever reason, have had that ability to do that.
Mhm.
It's interesting.
My hope is always to have these as more of a conversation. This is the first time that that's really happened, and now I've completely lost track of my notes.
Well, that's totally fine because
Yeah.
it's a very interesting conversation. I mean, for those of you who don't know me, I've never really spoken to Bob before. And that's part of the interesting thing about writing about these things is you get interested in other people and their lives that are different in very different ways. Yeah.
And just kind of a general question, what is your hope for this book? What do you hope people take away from it?
Okay, so that's a good question too. So I do write in the book about really hard things, like really, really hard things. But I also want people to know that the book is not a book. I don't see the book as a book of despair. I see the book as a book of hope. And the book ends with yellow flowers, which is yellow flowers they're not a feel-good thing. Flowers are tenacious and strong and passionate. More than anything else for the book, I realized when I was writing it that I was given the gift of these stories from people who are both professionally involved with addiction and people whose lives have just been changed in incredible ways by addiction. But they gave me these stories, and I want other people to benefit from them, to see the sort of depth in them, to see the luminosity in them. And so I hope they go forward and change people's lives who need them. Like when I needed to read a book, that book came to me.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's for people who are struggling with addiction or know someone who is, or maybe people who are just curious about the world around them. So,
and kind of on the note of community, there's a lot of questions that you asked that I highlighted that we'll now try to revisit.
okay.
Of one of the questions that you asked was, does society foster addiction? Now, having run through this, do you feel that that's kind of a true statement, or at least part of the problem of addiction?
Yes, I do. Actually, on many, many, many levels. I think it's really important to acknowledge, as has been well written about and well documented about, that there are people who profit immensely from opioids who should not profit from them and have profited scandalously from drugs that are very addictive. There's no question about that. So there's a capitalist bent as well, both legal and illegal, and there's really no question about that. But our society also is a very broken society at this time. And if you're it's a sign of a very unhealthy society when addiction is so rife across it. So we can try to look at people as individuals who are struggling with addiction, but really we should be looking at society as a whole. Where are the weaknesses in society? Why do we have people who are really struggling with all kinds of things, right? Poverty is a big one of them. Racism is a big one of them. But there's many more things, lack of community, lack of spirituality, right? But the interesting thing is the pandemic has brought all those to light. I mean, we see it like immediately, it brought all these broken places in our society incredibly apparent, especially last summer.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also hope going forward. We can't fix these things till we start to really look at them, even when they seem overwhelming, because these are huge things. These are societal things.
For somebody that has read your book and is hopeful to try to enact some sort of small change in their own community, what do you have any suggestions on what first steps they might take?
I would start right where you are and not worry about changing the whole rest of the world because it's overwhelming. And if you can start just by yourself and looking at yourself and how you treat other people, how you act in the world, whether you treat other people with respect and dignity, even when you don't understand them. If we all just tried to start at that one spot, the world would be moved one step closer to a better world. And that's challenging. I'm going to put that there. I make my share of errors and I'm going to acknowledge all of them. But if we at least tried to do that as individuals, that's a good place to start.
And this is a question that I meant to ask earlier, but we're going to circle back to it. Between the question of the balance between punishment and compassion was something that you explored in your interviews. Can you talk about, I'm interested in some of the things that, like harm reduction, some of the more compassionate aspects of what people are trying to do.
So harm reduction is something I didn't really know about until I started asking around, and a nurse actually gave me a great lecture on what harm reduction is. And in a nutshell, harm reduction is try to keep people alive. And this is geared pretty much towards people who are really using very powerful narcotics. So the idea behind this is try to get people physically stabilized, because you can't really begin to approach recovery until you're at a place of physical stability. And sometimes that means obviously detoxing. Sometimes that means all kinds of other help, finding childcare, finding housing, finding a job, right? All of those are elements of that. But to start first with physical wellness and then move towards trying to build a life from there. That's complicated because relapse is so endemic, right? So harm reduction can be offered to the same person like Sam, like maybe 20 times. He may go in and out of an ER room over and over and over, but sometimes that works. Yeah.
We have a comment/question that came in from Leslie Phillips. She worked as a substance abuse therapist treating teenage boys for 13 years. She's come to find out that many people touched by addiction develop a great deal of resilience, while others seem to really struggle with this. What factors have contributed to the development of resilience in your life? Either of us.
Do you want to go first, Bob?
Sure.
I'd be curious to know.
For me, it was a number of things. I'm very open about talking about the experience that I had growing up with a dad who was mostly not around, but also knowing that he was dealing with an addiction. And that was my entire life. Like, I didn't know, like, to put it on a smaller level, my birthday is 3 days after Christmas. And people like always have the question of like, oh, doesn't that stink having a birthday so close to Christmas? I'm like, well, that's when my birthday always was. So I don't know I don't know what it's like to have a birthday not close to a major holiday. And for me, it was just, this is the way my life was. It wasn't until like I was in college and like I was dating a girl who had a quote unquote normal family that I like realized I'm like, oh, this is this is what a family is, and this is what normal supposedly is. So for me, that was a big part of it, and also my mom was resilient through the whole thing. I was the youngest of my three siblings, so I was able to kind of see how they were dealing with things and the decisions that they made. And I kind of modeled my behavior off of that. So it was more so I, being the youngest in that environment, it was the pressure of I don't want to disappoint the other people in my family by making the wrong decision. So I was always nervous, like my dad is an addict. I know that's a possibility for me. So like I never had a drink of alcohol until like a couple months before I turned 21, and that was at my brother's wedding. So it was just making very conscious decisions of based around the experience that I grew up in.
That's an interesting answer, and it's a really good question too. I mean, resilience is also a complicated thing that takes a long time to develop, like you did from a young age, right? And for me, resilience for me, I think, would come out of me very similar to what you said, and similar to what I found from other people too, is it's connected to other people. It's never just resilience for yourself, but it's resilience because you're connected to someone else and you love someone else. I think that's one of the biggest factors that took me a long time to realize is if it wasn't for my daughters and my family, I probably never would have ever gotten sober. I really think that. Yeah. But the other thing is I really wanted to have a better life, and I had taste of that. And I think resilience is also where you want something better and you want something stronger. And once you get more and more of a taste of that, you're more likely to go that way when you see that's a real option.
Mm-hmm. An experience that I just recall my sister having. She used to teach at an inner city school, and she was open in sharing her experience growing up, and to what Shauna had said in the book of like recovery is possible, letting people know that there are options outside of not even just drug addiction, but kind of getting out of and getting past whatever your current situation is. It is possible. We had the benefit of being white in the suburbs where when all that comes along with that. But I think having that as a model for them hopefully helps.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a good point too, because that's one of the other things that I really reflected on is when you have privilege and when you see privilege, acknowledge it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And say, hey, I've had this privilege. And everyone in my book in some way or another acknowledged that. Even people who I thought had the hardest possible lives, like Shauna Shepherd had an incredibly hard life, right? But she herself considered herself privileged in certain ways. And that's what made her give back to other people. Since I finished the book, she went on, she became a medical assistant. It's like, wow, you've taken every advantage you could of your situation in a really positive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's also a very timely conversation in regard to privilege, who has it and what we do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Leslie. That was great.
Yeah, that was a great question.
I think I've gone through my question. I don't think that I did, but I think we touched on all of the things that I did want to talk about. If there's any questions that anyone else has, feel free to plug those in, and we'll try to address them. But I really enjoyed this conversation. Was there any final notes that you wanted to add into the discussion here, Brett?
We talked about an awful lot of things, and actually this was a totally different conversation than I thought it would be, but I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation. And I guess if there's one thing that I would put forward, I can see in my life, and I can see in the lives of many people, that there's this tension between creation and destruction, and it's never black and white. It's never this or that. It's kind of woven in there. But if you can move your life over towards some kind of positive light, away from the darkness, that is possible to do. And I just, for the longest time in my life, I never expected that for myself. And only when I began to really see, hey, this is something I want, that I really began to move towards that. So I just want to put that out there for people. These are really difficult things, and they're painful to many people, but they're not. Let's not shove them under the rug. Let's really pull them out and move on from there. I guess that's what I would say more than anything else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book. I enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate it, and I think it's something that's inherent in every librarian that I know, of a pursuit of knowledge and truth. So I'm glad that you went through that journey and you shared a lot of personal information, personal history, but also how your thoughts evolved over time, which is not something that always happens in the world of social media, where people are hard fast and this is what I think and I don't care about any other facts that might lead me down a different path. So yeah. I'm glad that you were able to have that and express that, because it's an important story. So if there's no other questions, I will plug the book one more time. Unstitched is available in our store, as well as available on our website, obpbooks.com. If you're not from the area and you're watching or listening to this later, pick it up in your local independent bookstore. If they don't have it, tell them to order it in, because it's a good one.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the openness of your conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
We have a few events coming up that I want to plug. One that, if you've watched any of our other events, I've been stressing about this next event for months. We'll be talking with Tufa Jallo on Wednesday, October 13th. Her book is called Tufa. It comes out the day before we have a chance to chat with her, so you can pre-order that one. She was sexually assaulted by the president of Gambia and came forward with her story, and it started a Me Too movement in that country that spread through Africa. She's now a student in Toronto, but living between Toronto and, apparently it's called the Gambia, which I just learned in an email today. So we'll be talking with her October 13th, which is a Wednesday at 7 p.m. Melanie Moyer is our event on October 27th, and that's the Original Glitch. Melanie is Original Glitch is a sci-fi, kind of a dystopian sci-fi story. So we've had a lot of heavy topics. We'll be able to just talk about some weirdness for a little while. And then another book that came out the same day as Unstitched is These Bones by Kayla Chanel. She is another author with Lanternfish Press, which we've been doing most of our events with Steerforth and Lanternfish Press. These Bones is kind of a gothic. It's a good story for Halloween. It's deals with racism, but deals with it in a gothic mystery noir sort of way. It's my next book that I'll be reading, and it's available to pick up in store as well as online. Thanks everyone so much for tuning in tonight. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're not watching on YouTube, head over to YouTube and subscribe, because that helps us. And also you can subscribe to our Weaponized Literacy podcast, where this conversation and others that we've had in the past will be available to listen to. Thanks again, and have a great night.
Thank you so much, Bob. Have a nice night.
You too.